Okay, as I was saying, last week we talked about how to think well, and I think that's a very important prerequisite. If you don't think well, you can't interpret well. I mean, that should go without saying. If if you were not making sure, I think we had that last week. There we go. Um, anyway, so that's one of the prerequisites. And the good news is anybody can learn to think more effectively. And but we need to think about thinking, and work on making sure that we are thinking reasonably, thoroughly, and not just uh, not thinking clearly about it, or in effect thinking with our emotions rather than with our heads. Um, but another important prerequisite. In fact, I had a former professor by the name of Donald Carson who said that the number one most important quality for an interpreter was the ability to read well. So that's our next section, learning to read well. And I'll be specifically talking about the Bible, but there are principles here that will apply beyond that, but specifically it's the Bible that we're talking about. So in order to learn to read the Bible well, first of all, we just need to learn to read. And there's a book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. It's been around for a long time. I think originally it was in the 50s. It's a very thick book. The first part is about reading, how to read well, and then the last part goes into reading specific kinds of literature: fiction, nonfiction, history, science, and so on.
Jim, would you repeat those authors?
Okay, Mortimer Adler is one author. The other one is Charles Van Doren. How to Read a Book. When I was first introduced to this book, I was not impressed. And I made the comment that before writing a book about how to read a book, they should read a book about how to write a book. But I was wrong. I thought I was being very clever, but the truth is it's a great book, and the judgment's really on me, not on the book. But in their book, they talk about 4 levels of reading, and all of these apply to reading the Bible. And the 4 levels are: first, there's the elementary reading, and this is just what this is what we learn in elementary school. This is basic reading. You can read the words. You recognize them. You can sound them out or whatever, but you can read the words. This is not a deep form of reading, but it is a necessary kind of reading because it's necessary as a beginning point. You can't go to the higher levels of reading unless you've gotten this one down. So elementary reading is very important. Second level, inspectional reading. Inspectional reading is skimming for an overview. In a non-biblical sense, one of the ways that I would use this, and the idea is, okay, you can read the words, but skimming means you can read them well enough that you can skim through. Inspectional reading means you can skim through a document, a book, or an article, and you can get the gist of it even though you haven't read all of it, because you're able to read part of it and you move through it. One of the ways I have used this is before I read a nonfiction book. Fiction's different, but before I read a nonfiction book, I go to the table of contents. The table of contents will give you an idea of what it's about and how it's laid out as far as the chapters. Then I start going through the chapters, and in each chapter, I read the first paragraph and the last paragraph, and I skim what's in between. And that's for each chapter of the book. It is, it's really impressive how much you can learn about a book just by doing that. I mean, you haven't read the whole thing, but getting the first paragraph and last paragraph of each chapter and skimming through each chapter really gives you an awful lot. And I do that before I read a nonfiction book because it helps orient me toward the book. It makes the flow of it. I know up front what the flow is and how the author is approaching what he's doing. Now, how does that apply to the Bible? You can do the same thing. But what I have done is the way I use it. You may use it different ways, but the way I use it, let's say I'm studying a specific passage. Let's say I'm studying Hosea chapter 6. Hosea chapter 6, you'll probably hear me say this more than once, but Hosea chapter 6 didn't just drop out of heaven one day. There's a context to it, and part of the context is the whole book of Hosea. And so when I'm studying Hosea 6, it's helpful to read the whole book of Hosea to see how it fits in, but also it can be helpful as I keep studying it to just skim through Hosea to get the high points and to get the basic flow of the book. And you can do that with other books. Sometimes it just comes as a refresher on the book. I've read this book before, I'm familiar with the book, but I just need a little bit of a refresher. And so if I skim through it briefly, I can do that. So first there's elementary reading, then inspectional reading, then analytical reading. Analytical reading is reading for understanding. It's more in depth. Basic reading, you know the words. Inspectional reading, you know the words well enough to skim through it and get the flow. But in analytical reading, you're really reading for understanding, as deep an understanding as you can master. So in analytical reading, you're analyzing sentences, paragraphs, sections, and in our study of interpretation, the emphasis throughout will be on analytical reading. These others all have an important place, but our emphasis is going to be on analytical reading. And that means you're reading with understanding, and that actually comes in different levels. My reading with understanding has grown over time. I can read with understanding in a better way now than I could 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And so this is something you can definitely grow in. And with analysis, with analytical reading, you read a sentence and you're actually able to not just breeze through it or take a general stab at what it means, but you're actually able to analyze the language, how the language is being used. And the same thing for a paragraph or for a section. And the better you get at it and the more time you spend with it, the more you're able to find connections within, for instance, within the paragraph or the section. And you begin noticing, okay, this is the key word. And this key word appears, let's say, 3 times in this paragraph. Or here's a key phrase. The the section begins with this key phrase and it ends with the same phrase. At one time, I simply wouldn't have noticed those things. But they're important in understanding what the author is doing, because there's a reason why he put them there. There's a reason why he used the same wording. Also, part of analysis would be something like finding the big idea. Every book has a big idea, and sections within the book each will have a big idea of some kind. And analysis is how we find those. So that's the third level. The fourth level is synoptical reading. Synoptical reading. Some of you are familiar with that term already, because sometimes Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. Synoptical reading, as Adler and Van Doren talk about it, is comparative reading. You can compare what you're reading here to different books in relationship to each other. So I read this book of philosophy, let's say, outside the Bible. Let's say I read this book of philosophy, and I'm able to compare it to a different philosopher, perhaps, or maybe another writing by this same author. The reason Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels is anybody who begins to read them realizes they are similar to each other. They're not exactly the same at all, but they're similar. So the same stories, often in the same wording, will appear in two or three of them, all three of them. Now, some of those same stories will appear in the Gospel of John, but John is different than the other three. He really does his own thing. But the other three have similarities. Many of the same stories, not totally the same. Each one is unique, but same stories, and often in at least basically the same order. So the idea of the synoptic gospels is that you can compare the three to each other, but we go beyond that, I think, in our biblical study. Now, in biblical study, and I will come back to this. This is a very big point. Is we should start with whatever book we're studying. Let's say we're studying Philippians. We start by concentrating on Philippians and not anything else, just Philippians. And the reason for that is when the original readers received Philippians, we don't know for sure what else they had. We're tempted to go other places in the New Testament, for instance, and gather up ideas that relate to Philippians, but don't start with that. I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do, but don't start with that, because for all we know, when the Philippians received that letter, they didn't have any other letters from Paul. We don't, or from anybody else or any other books in the New Testament. We don't know what they had. So all we can assume is that they had Philippians. They probably also had the Greek translation of the Old Testament. They probably had that. That's reasonable to think that, but we don't even know that for sure. We only know they had Philippians. So start with Philippians, and Paul, or whoever the New Testament writer is for different books, unless they make it obvious that they're assuming that the readers have other books from the New Testament, we shouldn't assume that. For instance, using Philippians, by assuming that they only had Philippians means that Paul expected them to understand that letter without the help of any other writings from the New Testament. As I said, there are implications that they had the Old Testament. And of course, the Old Testament had been written, but these are, for the most part, Gentile Christians. And but very early on, the Old Testament became the Bible of the early church as the New Testament was being written. And so most of them, it's probably a fair assumption that most of them would have it, or at least have part of it. But you start with the book itself. But synoptical reading means I've started with the book, I've concentrated on this one book, in this case Philippians, and I get a feel for what it's about and what it means. Then after I've really spent a lot of time trying to understand Philippians, I can then begin synoptically comparing it. Think of it as concentric circles. The inner circle is Philippians. The next circle, since the inner circle is Philippians, the next circle are the other writings of Paul. And we can go to those because even if they hadn't been written yet, even if the readers hadn't had them, Paul had a certain mindset, he had a certain vocabulary, he had a certain way of reasoning and writing about things. And sometimes by going to the wider circle of Paul's letters, we can find things that will help us in understanding Philippians. But don't start there. Start with what the book itself says. That's the primary thing. Then after we've done that, first the book itself, then the other writings of Paul, then you can go to the rest of the New Testament. And again, there will be themes that are interspersed throughout the New Testament. Then after we go to the New Testament, we go to the entire Bible. And kind of an exception to that would be if any New Testament book quotes or alludes to the Old Testament, then we know that the writer was using that. And it's important to go there and understand that. And I again, this is a big point with me, and I'll be saying more about it. It's one of the things I have found to be such a blessing in Bible study. Originally, there was a writer by the name of C.H. Dodd who wrote a book called According to the Scriptures. Dodd was pretty liberal, so granted that, but he made, I think, a really outstanding point that when the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament or allude to something in the Old Testament, they're not quoting a verse, but a context. And that in order to understand what they're doing, you need to go back and understand the context. And I have found, picking up on Dodd's point, I have just found that it's enriched my understanding of the New Testament and the Old Testament, for that matter, tremendously. Now, I can't tell you how big the context is. When you go back to the Old Testament context of something that's quoted or alluded to might be a few verses. It might be several verses. It might be a whole book. And there's no rule of thumb that I have that will tell you what that is, just that you should go back and refer to that. Okay, I saw it disappeared again, but Kenva, I think you asked a question or made a comment, but I don't see, how do I find that chat, maybe?
I'm just asking, would you say that when you're studying synoptically that, like you gave the example of Philippians, you start with Philippians and you look at that with analytical reading and then move out analytically, or is there more to it than that?
Well, okay, good question. We start with an analysis of the book itself, the passage, and the book itself. We start it with analysis of that. Synoptical means we're able to compare what we find in that book, in this case Philippians, with other things in the Bible. But reading it synoptically, while it's important, it's secondary to, first of all, analyzing the book itself and understanding it. And it becomes more complicated when you start comparing it with other things, because it means you have to understand those other things You have to be able to analyze them too. Sometimes people will come to a passage and they'll say, that makes me think of, and they go off to another passage. That's fine if the other passage really relates to this one. But sometimes it may not really relate. It may be, it may just be something totally different, and we have just sort of imagined that they fit together when they don't really fit together. Does that make sense? Anyway, I will assume it does.
Yes, it does. It makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. In anything, if you're comparing them, you have to make sure you understand them individually before you compare them. And okay, so learn to read, and there's those 4 levels that I find very helpful from Adler and Van Doren. Second, and some of these points, by the way, these are of unequal length. Number 2, not only learn to read, but read daily. Read the Bible daily is specifically what I'm saying. Make it a habit. And there's more than one reason why this is important. For one thing, I would assume, unless you're on a fast, you eat physical food every day. You do that because it nourishes your body. It gives you energy. You need it for good health. And we like it. Reading the Bible is something like that, only rather than physical nutrition, it's giving us spiritual nutrition. Why would we think we need physical food every day and then think that we need spiritual food once a week, once a month? Okay. The more we feed ourselves spiritually through the Word of God, the more we grow spiritually or are able to grow spiritually. Now, of course, just reading the Bible doesn't mean that we'll grow. We could just ignore it or not really believe it. But I assume this group believes the Bible and wants to grow in reading it. And so make it a habit. And the other reason why reading daily I think is important is I don't know, maybe you're not like me, but I get into certain patterns. And it's easy for me to get out of those patterns. A different thing, but an example would be when it comes to health, when it comes to exercise. If I'm not rigid about it, walk every day, do my weights 3 times a week, same days if possible. If I'm not rigid about that, if I say, oh, I'll skip today, I have a tendency the next day to say, I'll skip today. I'll skip today. And after a while, I realize it's been a week or a month without any exercise. And reading the Bible daily is something like that. At least for me, if I read it daily, it's a habit I get into. I call it a holy habit. And I will keep doing it. But if I break that, I will have a tendency to get away from it without realizing that I've done that, perhaps. Number 3, read broadly and narrowly. Read broadly and narrowly. What I mean by that is you read broadly for the big overview of the Bible, and you read narrowly in specific books. And we need both of those. It's not a choice whether we're going to do one or whether we're going to do the other. We need both of them. So reading broadly would mean reading the entire Bible, getting the sweep of the entire biblical picture. And so I would suggest reading through the Bible on some regular basis. There are a lot of reading plans out there for reading the Bible in a year, and it's good. But for my purposes, I don't care. Read it in 6 months, read it in a year, read it in 2 years. What's most important is that you read through it, not how fast you do it. Also, I want to encourage you to make this an ongoing habit, not an event. I've known some people who read through the Bible once, and they spend the rest of their lives bragging about the fact that they read through the Bible once. That's not what this is about. To get the big overview of the Bible, we just need to keep doing it. So take a year or 2 years to read through it, and then when you get done, do it again. There are different ways to do it, and there are different plans. The simplest, no frills approach is just you start reading in Genesis, and you read until you get to the book of Revelation. That's a very good way to do it. It's the way I'm doing it right now. But there are other ways to do it. The downside of reading it that way is we can run into certain parts of the Bible that aren't quite as exciting as other parts of the Bible. Sometimes I have facetiously called Leviticus the Bible reader's graveyard. Third book of the Bible, a lot of people who started out with a New Year resolution, going to read through the Bible, they get to Leviticus and it gets tough and they die there and the reading ends. Now that is very unfortunate. I think Leviticus is a fantastic book if it's rightly understood. The problem is we may have the wrong expectations for it when we come to it, and it just is tedious to us, when it can be exciting if we understand what's going on with it. But that's the downside to it. We can run into certain parts that aren't quite as exciting and we give up. Don't give up, just keep going. Now, another approach that I have used that has its own advantages is you start with the Old Testament. Let's say you read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Then after you have read those books, go to the New Testament and take one of the Gospels, let's say Matthew, and read that. Then come back and read another section of the Old Testament, maybe Joshua through Ruth or something. Go read another one of the Gospels. Come back again, take the next section of the Old Testament, read that. Then go and read Luke. Then come back and read another section and go back and get John. And you do that throughout the entire Bible, not just the Old Testament, but throughout the Old and New Testament. You keep going back and reading one of the Gospels. Now, in that approach, you read the Gospels several times more than you read anything else in the Bible. But it has the advantage of keeping us focused on Jesus. I mean, he is the heart of the Bible. He's the point. The whole Old Testament builds and points toward him, and the whole New Testament points back to him. So, I mean, he's the key to the whole thing. And so that would have a way of keeping him in front of us. And as I said, I've used both of those approaches, and there are others as well. But whatever approach you use, it should help you get the sweep, the big picture of the Bible. Now, the reason that's important is when you study an individual book, it fits in some way into that overall broad view sweep of the Bible. It fits into that in some way. And if we don't know what that overall picture of the Bible is, then we don't know how it fits. I mean, somebody reads Isaiah, and I've experienced this in a Bible class when they were studying Isaiah, and it became very apparent to me that they didn't know if Isaiah was written before or after Moses. They didn't have any idea of its historical context, of where it fit into the flow of the Bible. They had no idea. And it meant that they were misinterpreting things very badly because they simply didn't know how it fit into the big picture. So the big picture is important. But at the same time, that's reading it broadly. We also need to read it narrowly. Broadly gives us the big picture, but it doesn't give us that many of the details. Narrowly gives us the details that fit into the big picture. So that's the reason we need both of those. And for narrowly, what I'm talking about is studying one book at a time. And you can do it in any books in any order you want to do them in. But you're studying a book. And my suggestion for this is there's more than one way to do this, okay? But my suggestion is that you pick out a book that you'd like to study. Anything you like. Some book in the New Testament or the Old Testament, some biblical book you'd like to study. And then, depending on the length of the book and on your interest in this particular book, decide how much time you're going to spend studying it. What I mean is, let's say our book is Colossians. Colossians has 3 chapters. How much time do I want to spend with it? Let's say I decide I'm going to spend 6 months. Doesn't have to be. It could be 3 months. But let's say 6 months. Then my suggestion is, at the beginning of the study of Colossians, you just read it over and over and over again. A minimum of 3 times, but better 4, 5, 6 times. You read it over and over again. And you will find if you do that, that you will understand much more about the book after you've read it the 4th, 5th, or 6th time than you did the first time. So you read it over and over and over again. Then you begin studying it passage by passage through the book. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. And you begin going through it section by section. And at this point, and we're going to come back to this next week, but at this point, what I'm encouraging you to do is study the book without the help of any other resources except a concordance. And I'll teach you how to use a concordance in the way that I'm suggesting here. And don't even use a concordance if you don't have to. In Colossians, you probably don't have to. In Isaiah, you probably do. 66 chapters, okay? So you start studying the book and using methods that I'll be teaching you, but you just concentrate on going through it paragraph by paragraph and analyzing each paragraph. Then after you've done that for a period of time, let's say you start out, you spend a month reading it over and over again. You spend the second month studying it on your own. And it all depends on how much time you have, by the way. Maybe it needs to be 2 months. It depends on how much time you have to devote to it. And then after that, let's say I said 6 months. Let's say you spent 1 month reading, two additional months studying it on your own, and then another 3 months reading everything you can get your hands on about the book. Commentaries, Bible dictionaries, atlases, anything you can get your hands on. Good stuff. Find somebody who knows books and who will recommend things to you, because there's a lot of stuff out there. And for instance, on the internet's easy, and there's very accessible, and there's a lot of information there. But the problem is, some of the information is excellent, and some of it's terrible. And you need to be discerning enough to know the difference between wonderful and terrible. Same applies to books. I have a prejudice toward books, or a bias toward them, maybe I should say, is a better way to put it. But you read everything you can get your hands on. And again, I will be saying more about that when I give my model of study. So read broadly and narrowly. Suggestion number 4, or principle number 4, Read entire books in one sitting if possible. Read entire books in one sitting if possible. Now, obviously, it's easier to read the one chapter of Obadiah in one sitting than it is the 66 chapters of Isaiah. And I recognize that. If you don't have time to spend one period of time reading all of Isaiah, then read it as quickly as possible. If you can't read it in one sitting, then how about 2 or 3, as opposed to a paragraph or a chapter a week. And the reason I say read it in one sitting is you will get something from you'll get something from that you do not get in any other way. For instance, I'll give it for instance. The book of Revelation is confusing to people. It's a wonderful book. It's the greatest book that's ever been written on spiritual warfare. But most people read it and it's just mind-blowing. It's confusing. There are all these images and people have trouble figuring out what the images are, and they've been told a lot of stuff about it's end of the world stuff, which my understanding of the book of Revelation is it is not primarily about the end of the world at all. Is there some end of the world stuff? Yeah, but it's not the main thrust of the book. But anyway, so people get confused. One thing that can help, it doesn't take away all the confusion, but one thing that can help is read the entire book of Revelation in one sitting. You won't understand all the images, but you will get the flow. And that is really important. And any other books, read them in one sitting and you will find you get the big picture of them in a way that you don't when you read a paragraph or even a chapter at a time. So read in one sitting if possible. Number 5, start at the beginning of the book rather than skipping around. A time-honored way to read the Bible for many people has been what I would call the favorite passages approach. I love Genesis 1, so I read Genesis 1. I love Exodus 20, 10 Commandments, so I read Exodus 20. I love the 23rd Psalm, so then I read the 23rd Psalm. I love Isaiah 53 about Jesus. I read Isaiah 53. I love Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Sermon on the Mount, and so on. And so I just read my favorite passages. And that's not bad. Do that if you want to do that. But don't make that the core of your reading. Because unless you understand Genesis and Exodus and Matthew, you will have simply ripped those things out of context. And while they're meaningful, you will have missed an awful lot of the meaning by not reading them in context. So read things in context, and one of the ways that's important in doing that is starting at the beginning of the book and not simply skipping around in it. Number 6, read in different translations. Read in different translations. What I encourage is to select one translation as your basic study Bible. And I suggest a standard translation. Now, when I say standard translation, what I mean is this is not, it's not something done by an individual like the J.B. Phillips translation of the New Testament or the Message. Those are both done by one individual, different individuals, but one individual each. A standard translation is done by a committee, and preferably the committee is from different religious groups. Now, the reason I say that is they have a tendency to keep each other honest. If all the translators are from one group, then then they're going to have the same biases when they look at the text. And it's more difficult for them to get outside of it and translate as accurately as possible. The worst example of this that I know of is the New World Translation. It was done by a committee, but a committee of Jehovah's Witnesses. And it's terrible. When it first came out, somebody wrote a review called How Not to Translate the Bible, or How to Not Translate the Bible. And I think that title said it quite well. The problem was the Jehovah's Witnesses, who don't believe in the deity of Christ, simply took their beliefs and put them into a translation. And they try to justify some of their weird translations, but they can't. Even an elementary Greek student would know better than, John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. A God? An elementary Greek student should know better than that, but they try to defend it. But they defend it because they don't understand Greek. So far better if you've got a variety of people and they have good credentials for translating. But even at that, different translations have different philosophies of translating. Some are more literal, some are more paraphrased. And there's a spectrum from literal to paraphrased. There is no perfectly literal translation. If there was, it would be unreadable. It's just the nature of language. As literal as it gets would be the American Standard Version of 1901. That's as literal as it gets. And its British cousin, the English Revised Version, which was really the same translation, but it was using English language, and the American Standard was using American. So otherwise, they're the same. And the Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon, who preached in London in the 1800s, commented on the ERV, and his comment was, "Good Greek, poor English." The ASV is not easy to read. It is literal, but it's not easy to read. But that's real literal. On the other end, you've got something like the Living Bible or the Message that's just totally paraphrased. In the Living Bible, it said, rather than your word is a light to my path, it's your word is a flashlight to my path. That's just totally paraphrased, totally not what the text originally said. So you've got this spectrum. On the one hand, toward the more literal, without being as literal as the ASV, you've got the New American Standard, the Revised Standard, the New Revised Standard, the English Standard Version. Did I say New American Standard? Anyway, New American Standard would be one of those. Those are all more literal. A centralist translation would be the New International Version, NIV. Ones that are more paraphrased, but not as far as the others I mentioned would be, and their committee translations are the New English Bible and the Revised New English Bible, and also the NLT, the New Living Translation. The New Living Translation is not related to the Living Bible. It's something different, and it's very paraphrased. Now, my problem with that is that it interprets the text for you. It doesn't give you the literal, even close to a literal meaning. It interprets it. I agree with most of their interpretations, but still, I think it's better. I think I am in favor of the more literal ones. Okay. I grew up with the King James, as a lot of people did. At a time, I switched to the ASV. Then I gave up on those and I went to the NIV. And most of my life, I have used the NIV. But recently, under the heading of you can teach an old dog new tricks, I've started using the ESV. I still like the way the NIV reads better than the ESV. But in study, I find the ESV really helpful because it is more literal. And as we talk more about study and the method of study that I encourage, you'll understand why I would want something that's more literal. You can use the NIV. I did for years. It can be used, but you just have to understand not just its strengths, but also its weaknesses. But that's true of all translations. I had a teacher, Jack Lewis, who wrote kind of the definitive book on translations. And his comment about translations was pick your own flowers. And what he meant was every translation has strengths and everyone has weaknesses. Pick your own flowers. What weaknesses can you live with and what strengths do you have to have? And make a decision. Okay, so read different translations. Now, I said to start out with a basic study Bible. Decide what it is. It's the NIV, it's the ESV, it's NRSV, whatever. You decide. But then, using that as your basic study Bible means you read it over and over, and this is what you study out of. But it is also helpful then if you read some other translations, hopefully something that's more literal and something that's more paraphrased, because they will help you see the text in a different way. Also, because, for instance, in Greek, it's true in Hebrew, but probably even more in Greek, there's such a wide variety of the way something might be translated. A lot of Greek words have a spectrum of meaning. It's also true of Hebrew, but anyway, they have a spectrum of meaning, and different translations will emphasize different points on that spectrum. So reading more than one can often help you get the feel for the total meaning of the wording. Number 7, read aloud. If you've never read the Bible aloud to yourself, I would suggest trying it. There's something about your voice reading the Bible and hearing yourself read it that gives you a different perspective, and it can be a very powerful experience. I'm not saying it's the only way to read the Bible, but I'm saying every once in a while, just read it out loud. Number 8, read prayerfully. Read prayerfully. Some of my suggestions here are pray. For instance, pray before you read. Pray for understanding. Pray for an open heart. Pray for an obedient spirit. You can also pray after you read. And then I would especially emphasize praying for an obedient spirit. Okay, you've read this passage about love. Now am I going to obey it or am I not? So read before and after, or pray rather, before and after you read, and pray what you read. And what I'm suggesting here is, okay, you're reading something in the Bible. You're reading let's say you're reading 1 Corinthians 13, great chapter on love. And so you read through, especially the central section is the characteristics of love. And by the way, as an aside, I'll say, the Corinthian church to which this was written was a mess. spiritually speaking, they were unspiritual, they were immature, they played one-upsmanship with the gifts that God had given them. My gift is better than your gift, kind of games. They chose their favorite leaders, and we have no reason to believe that those leaders, which included Paul, Peter, and Apollos, we have no reason to believe that any of those wanted anything to do with their games. But they would choose these leaders and say, oh, well, Paul's my man. He knows that these other guys, they're not so good, but he's great. Or Apollos or Peter, whatever. And they didn't treat each other well. And when Paul writes 1 Corinthians 13, it really is a rebuke. If you look through the characteristics of love that he lists there, they violate every one of them. So with that in mind, let's say today you have been reading 1 Corinthians 13. Well, then you can turn 1 Corinthians 13, especially that central section, well, all of it, actually, you can turn it into a prayer in which you pray to have the same attitude toward love that you find in that passage, and to develop those characteristics in yourself. Pray that you will be kind and patient and so on. And you can do that with most passages in the Bible. There are some that are harder than others. Some of them are very individual. You're praying, okay, I have studied this passage, and now I pray that God will make me into the kind of person I've just read about. But also, it can be group. Sometimes you may read group. You may read passages that have to do with the group, either ancient Israel or the church. And you can pray that the people of God, that the church will be the kind of people that are pictured here. William Booth read the book of Acts, and it was said after reading about the explosive growth of the book of Acts, he prayed, Lord, do it again. Lord, do it again. And for us to put ourselves into the passage that we're reading and to look for God to fulfill that in us as individuals or as a group is a powerful thing. Number 9, rewrite the text in your own words. Rewrite the text in your own words. In other words, paraphrase the text. When I was in school, I had a teacher by the name of Clyde Woods, who I had for, I had him for a number of things, but this specifically came out of a course that I had him for on minor prophets. And his term assignment for minor prophets was we were to paraphrase every paragraph of every minor prophet. And at the time, it just seemed like tremendous busy work. But at some point, I realized I was learning a lot about the minor prophets. Because in order to paraphrase it, I had to understand it well enough to paraphrase it. And it wasn't a matter of just going to a newer translation and slipping that in there. No, I was paraphrasing it. I was putting it in my own words, which meant I had to understand it well enough to do that. And I would suggest that if you're studying a passage of Scripture, that it's a good exercise to just put it in your own words. You have to understand it well enough to do that. And you have to understand how it works. You really need to be able to analyze it at least to some extent to grasp it, to then paraphrase it. Number 10, meditate on what you read. The Old Testament in particular uses the word meditation quite a bit. In Psalm 1, There's a contrast between the wicked and the good man. And interestingly, the basic contrast is that the good person meditates on the law of the Lord, and that's, in their language, that's shorthand for Scripture. He meditates on the Word of God, on the law of the Lord, day and night. Biblical meditation is different from the meditation of Eastern religions. Sometimes today, the idea of meditation, in fact, most of the time, when people talk about meditating, they're talking about meditating Buddhist, like a Buddhist. But biblical meditation and Eastern meditations are different from each other. In Eastern meditation, a person empties his or her mind. There's an emptying quality. But in biblical meditation, it's the very opposite. Rather than emptying, you're filling. You're filling yourself with the Word of God. And having filled yourself with the Word of God, you meditate on it, which means you allow it to go over and over and over in your mind. I'm hearing something, but I'm not understanding words. Anyway, we are filling ourselves with the Word of God and thinking about it, thinking about the meaning of it, thinking about how it applies to our lives, and that's one reason. There are different. You can do this at different times. I mean, your quiet time with Scripture can be at different times during the day, and early morning, noon, evening, all of those have advantages. I like early morning because the whole day flows from that. I've done it around noontime, and that's a nice break in the day and a way to reorient yourself to things spiritual. In the evening, it's a great way to wind down. It's a whole lot better way than watching TV or being on the internet. But it's a good way to wind down, but it does something more than that. It leaves you these high, holy thoughts to think about when you go to sleep. And so each of those has its advantage. If you do it in the morning, you can do it with any of these, but it's probably easier in the morning. If you read the Word of God in the morning, then you take something from what you just read, and you meditate on it. You think about it and how it applies to your life and what it means throughout the rest of the day. Okay, number 11, and final. This is the final one. Read actively. Read actively. This is as opposed to being passive. As a passive reader, we just read words. We may think about the words a little bit, but not too much. We don't want to tax ourselves. But that lends itself to, have you ever read something in the Bible and as soon as you got done realized you didn't have any idea what it was you just read? That means you were reading passively. Yeah, you were reading words, but the words weren't going in. They couldn't even lodge enough for you to say what it was you had just read. Reading actively, by the way, I'll tell you my solution to that kind of passive reading where you read and can't remember what it was you just read. I realized I was doing that quite a number of years ago now, and so I made an agreement with myself. I made a pledge to myself that if I ever found myself reading something in the Bible and then not being able to remember what it was I just read, that I'd go back and read it again. And if I still couldn't didn't know what I read, I'd read it again. And I would keep doing it until I knew what it was I'd read. And I did that, but I found that the very act of making that pledge meant that I was more alert in reading it the first time, so I didn't have to read it over and over unless I just wanted to. Now, sometimes I will read the same passage over because it's the way it strikes me. It's been such a wonderful experience. There's something in it that I realize I didn't quite catch or understand, and I'll read it again for that reason. But that's different from reading it again because you didn't have it, your mind was turned off the first time. Okay, reading actively, and some of this is, I'm indebted to How to Read a Book by Adler and Van Doren for some of this. Reading actively would include some of the following questions. First set of questions: what is the book about as a whole? What is the book about as a whole? What's the big idea? Or, well, maybe that's actually the next one. Anyway, what's the book about as a whole? The next one is, what is the main idea? That would be more, what's the big idea? What's the main idea or the main theme of the book? How does the author develop this theme? What supporting themes are there that support the main theme? Now, I didn't say this was easy. It can be very challenging, but it's very good. It's very good for us. Okay, second set of questions. What is being said in the book and how? Aside from what we've already said, and there's some overlap, try to discover the main ideas, assertions, and arguments that make up the author's message. Invariably, biblical books have a wide variety of purposes. Sometimes they're to comfort, sometimes they're to rebuke, sometimes they are, the emphasis is more on instruction. Sometimes they're meant to persuade. So what are the main ideas and assertions and arguments that make up the author's message?
Is this under the same point? Is this under what is said and how? Or is this a different point?
This is still under what is being said in detail and how.
Okay.
This, I thought about leaving this next one out because it's not going to apply to us, in one sense. But I think I'll leave it in anyway. This is Adler and Van Doren, and it doesn't have to do with the Bible specifically at all. And so you'll see why I have a little bit of reluctance with it, but I'll explain it. Okay, the third set of questions: is the book true in whole or in part? Knowing the author's mind is not enough. You must decide if what he says is true or not. Now, as Bible-believing people, we believe that the Bible is true. And so we believe that what the authors say is right, is correct. But it might be a good exercise for us to spend some time thinking through why we believe why this message makes sense, and why the truth of this message makes sense. Not from the standpoint of thinking it's not, but of being able to think about it in a different way. Anyway, fourth set of questions. What of it? why does the author think that what he is saying is important? Why do you think it's important? And in fact, if you want to take it a step farther, you could say, why or why not? Do you really think it's important? I mean, it's in the Bible, so we think it must be important. But have we really thought through about that? Do we really believe that it's important, what the writer's saying? Now, as we go on, we'll find other things, but this is just a way of saying read actively, think about what you're reading, think about the meaning of it, think about the truth of it, think about the implication of it, the importance of it. Okay, I read Joel. Why is the book of Joel important? Does it have a message for me? Does it have a message for our world? If so, what is it? That's different from just reading through things but without ever really thinking through what they mean. It's being active. Next week, we are going to go on to my basic model for Bible study, and it's going to be in-depth. It's going to be an examination of in-depth Bible study, and it is a method that I have used. Well, I've taken a lifetime to develop and to revise, and it works. And I will be I'll be sharing with you the best stuff I've learned about studying the text in depth. So we're through with this evening's session. If you have questions, comments, concerns, some of you came in later. I think I caught most people who came in, but I do want to make sure that everybody that was here is checked off on the list, so I know they in the office like to keep a record of these things. Anyway, any questions or comments before we close out?
Molly wants to say thank you so much. This is just full of information. My old brain is going to try to take it all in. Thank you.
Yeah, it may be maybe too much through the hose was coming out. But hopefully, thank you, and I hope it's a blessing.
Jim, this is David. Is last week's lesson posted anywhere?
I said this at the very beginning. No, it's not, but I plan to have it this week's and last week's on the Shibi YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Within the next few days.
Thank you.
Jim, one more question, Molly again. That How to Read a Book, that was by Mortimer Adler, Adler?
Yes.
Okay. And Charles Van Doren, Doran?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Thank you.
By the way, Adler is well known for other things he has written. He was I guess you'd say he was a philosopher. He was a philosopher, and was behind if you're familiar with there was a program called the Great Books of the Western World. He was the mind behind that. Really intelligent guy, and it's a book that's very worthwhile.
One other question. Do you believe it would be helpful to have a certain place where we did our reading and studying, as opposed to just anywhere we find ourselves at any given time? I'm thinking of Campbell. Anyway, Bethany, we've been there in Turk's home, and he had that separate little covered pavilion, little bitty room where he stood up at a pulpit and did all of his study early in the morning. But he started his day by walking the few yards to that isolated little area. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to. I think there is something about being in the same place, even as much as possible at the same time. I don't know that it's absolutely necessary, but I do think it's helpful, and especially something that gets you out of the hustle and bustle of the house. Yeah, I think that can be helpful. I have a place where I tend to do my reading, and I think there's something helpful about it.
I think it's helpful for prayer, but not necessarily. You get different perspective if you read it.
Kathy likes to have the same place for prayer, but not necessarily for Bible reading. Although you tend to read right here.
I do, but I also tend to read it on the other couch too. Sometimes it just gives you a different perspective because you're in a different place. And so it feels different.
She makes the point that sometimes it gives you a different perspective that she finds helpful.
But for study, I think probably the same place. I agree.
By the way, that makes me think of this doesn't have to do with place, but I think it is helpful to. I mentioned reading different translations, but also sometimes it's helpful, I think, even if you're reading your same translation, read it in a different edition so that the words are on a different place on the page. Because we can get so used to, this passage is there. And it's possible to, without realizing that mind goes into autopilot. But if it's a different edition so that it's a different place on the page, it has a way of kind of waking our brains up. But that's different from your question. But I guess I'd say if you find it helpful, I would say I find it helpful. Kathy likes a little bit of diversity.
Yeah, this is Chooks here.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's a very good study today. I've learned a lot. I just wanted to ask you on a personal level, and what you mentioned the different translations and how you have come to find. So how did you get to a point and you know that NIV or NLT is the best for you, and what led you to make a decision that this is what I'm comfortable with regards to different translations of the scriptures?
Well, like I said, if you go back through the whole story, I grew up with the King James, so I didn't really think about it.
Yeah.
I read that because that's what everybody read. Okay. Then in school, I was influenced by a teacher who used the ASV and made a case for it being very literal.
Yeah.
And so I continued using that, but I found really what changed me on that one was I taught teenagers. And they couldn't make heads or tails of it. They would just glaze over when I would read ASV to them. And when I would use the NIV, it caught their attention. And this was I was in graduate school at the time. And this was a country church that I was driving out to. And they started asking me to pick up copies of this translation for them. They were excited about it.
Yeah.
But at that point, I'd been using more than one. And I decided I needed to concentrate on something. And it became more and more obvious to me that the NIV communicated better. When I read the NIV, I felt like I felt like I was leaning against the well, listening to them. And I really liked that. So I continued using the NIV, but with the recognition that there were certain things about the NIV that I wasn't always crazy about. I liked how well it communicated. I liked the way the language was used in it. But I'll just give one thing. One thing I didn't like was sometimes, for instance, in the New Testament, there were in one book of the New Testament, you would have the same word in Greek that was used repeatedly throughout the book. Okay, same word. But the NIV would translate it in 2 or 3 different ways. So reading the NIV, reading the English of the NIV, you would never get the idea that different words were being used, or that the same word was being used. And that bothered me. And yet I continued to, partially because most people use the NIV, and partially because I liked how it read. But then I was introduced to, and I found myself at times using different things. I liked the RSV, or actually the older RSV in the Old Testament. I actually liked that better. But I was still sticking with the NIV. But then after the ESV came out, I found myself more and more being attracted to it because, for instance, within a book, if it's the same word that's being used in Greek or Hebrew, they will translate it using the same word unless there's some overwhelming reason to do something different. And so, given my way of study, I believe, and you'll hear this more when I give the in-depth approach that I have. Biblically, the writers of the Old and New Testament had a more limited vocabulary than we have in English. English has a very extensive vocabulary. The reason is the English language has been formed and developed with all kinds of streams of other languages coming into it. So we have a wealth of synonyms. Elephant, pachyderm, I don't know, or maybe better would be rabbit, bunny, cottontail, hare. But in Hebrew and Greek, they have far more limited vocabulary. And in English, in writing classes when I was growing up, we were told to vary things. But in Greek and Hebrew, they emphasize things by repeating the same word over and over again, or the same phrase. So repeated words and phrases are very important in understanding what the biblical writers are doing. And I like the ESV because it will use the same words and phrases to translate the same words and phrases.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a good explanation or not. I don't know if that communicates.
Yeah.
But that's how I've come to be there.
Okay. Yeah, like everybody has, as we keep on reading and studying and reflecting and meditating, at some point we're going to get to a comfort level with one of the translation that feels we are comfortable with. So I know it's got to be every individual, or every, it's going to be somehow different for everybody. So, and that is your own experience. So I just wanted to hear how you got to your own way of, being comfortable with one translation. Yeah, thank you.
Well, and I will also say this. I believe people should become comfortable with one translation. And part of the reason I say that is at one time when I was kind of in between, I was using a number of different translations. I mean, still, certain passages, if I quote them, will come out of the King James because that's the way I was raised. Yeah. There's some that may be more ASV. Most will be NIV. But at one time, I had King James in my head. I was reading the ASV mostly in the New Testament. I was reading the RSV in the Old Testament. I was reading the New American Standard and the New International. And I didn't really have one study Bible. I was reading a lot of different things. And I finally realized I couldn't quote anything anymore. Everything came out as a vague paraphrase. And so I really do believe, find a translation, pick your own flowers, find a translation that that has the strengths that you want, and you can live with its weaknesses because they all have them, and then compare it to others. I love reading the NLT, but I don't want to use it as my basic study Bible. But I love reading it. I find it even the message is very fresh. I would not use it as a study Bible, but it's a very fresh reading.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Good question.
Thank you.
Jim, it's Molly again. You said that Charles Spurgeon said concerning the English Revised Version that it was good Greek, poor English.
Yep.
What? And then you said the American Standard Version, what was said about it?
The American Standard Version is the American version of the English Revised Version. In the late 1800s in Great Britain, they produced the ERV, which was a revision of the King James. And the attempt was to make it more literal, the translation more literal, because actually people don't realize this, but the King James isn't that literal. But anyway, the ERV was to make it more literal. Then when that translation came across the pond to the American side, they found that a lot of the terms that they used were distinctively British. And Americans simply wouldn't understand a lot of the terminology. So there was a committee that basically Americanized the ERV, and that's what the American Standard is. And Spurgeon was a Brit, so his comment was actually about the ERV, but it would apply to the ASV. Good Greek, poor English. And part of what's behind that is, if you read passages, if you compare the King James, I mean, at that point, overwhelmingly, your choice was between the King James and the ERV or the ASV. There weren't a lot of other translations out there. And if you compare the King James and the ASV on virtually any passage, the ASV will get points for being literally accurate. But the King James will get points for being beautiful. And an example for the ASV would be, if in the Greek it's one sentence, in the ASV it's one sentence, even if that one sentence is 12 verses long. And in English, people get lost. in a sentence that is that long. So that's what prompted Spurgeon to say that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I still find the ASV at times helpful to compare, but the ESV is more literal. I mean, toward the literal side, but not that drastic. In fact, nothing is quite that drastic. Probably the closest would be the New American Standard. That's a revision of the American Standard. And the dean of the Bible college where I worked used the New American Standard. And it's not bad, but for me, it just seems the English is stiff. ESV is stiffer than I wish it was, but I don't think it's as stiff as the New American Standard. But see, I'm picking my own flowers, and he was picking his. So, and the ESV, well, it all goes back to the KJV, really. The American Standard was a revision of the King James. The Revised Standard was a revision of the American Standard. The ESV is a revision of the RSV. So that there are different streams of translations and how they were translated or revised. So how are you?
Are you
Emily,
asking how Molly is? I'm doing good, and I'm going to lead this discussion and look forward to next week. So thank you so very much.
Okay, good. See you next week.
Okay.
Jim, were you going to send those quotes from the 4 different writers about the?
I hadn't forgotten. I just hadn't gotten it done. But yes, I'm still going to do that.
Great. Thank you.
I know it would appear that I've totally forgotten, but I haven't.
Just appreciate that you're still working on it.
Yeah, I am. Anyway, thank you.
Uh-huh. Bye-bye.
Bye.